Hello, and thank you for stopping by. Welcome. Very happy that you are here with me today to learn how to talk about Docker with your database administrator. My name is Sean Scott. I work with databases and Docker. I probably shouldn't say anything, but I work with the evil empire of databases, Oracle, second least loved database in the 2021 Stack Overflow developer survey, but there is good news. We are holding a strong lead over DB2, so we're all good. I'm also an Oracle ace. Aces are Oracle's community advocates, sort of like Docker captains, but Larry Ellison gives us all free sailboats, which makes us actual captains. I've worked with databases for about 30 years, first as a developer, but mostly as a database administrator or engineer. And I've managed and designed databases and infrastructure for a wide variety of clients, including the government, the military, pharmaceutical companies, worked in higher ed, logistics, manufacturing, finance, retail, e-commerce, and so forth. I work for Viscosity North America as a managing principal consultant in our database practice. And there I perform upgrades, migrations, I build highly available and resilient systems. I develop and deliver training and labs for our consultants and customers. But the absolute best part of my job is that I get to write automation. I am a big believer in DevOps and the DevOps way of doing things after seeing firsthand how effective it is at simplifying and streamlining the management in large, complex environments. And it means I get to play in that wonderful intersection where database and infrastructure and code all come together. And nearly everything that I do on a regular basis runs through Docker. But that wasn't always the case. My first experience with Docker came back in 2014, and the company that I worked for decided that they were going to go cloud native. And my task was to put all of our databases into Docker. Well, Docker was brand new. I didn't know anything about it. So I reached out to some colleagues in the database world and people I trusted for advice. Well, that advice, run. Docker is a fad tech for developers, and if you can get a database to actually run on Docker, you are still in for a world of pain. It is slow. It is unreliable. Your database could disappear without warning. You will lose your data. It was awful. So I went to my boss and I shared this information with him. I begged. I even threatened at one point to quit, but he was unmoved. And instead of quitting, which I'll admit was a pretty empty gesture, I decided I was going to go along with this plan, but secretly I was going to prepare the most wonderful I told you so speech that I would give when everything burned down. And there was no fire and there was no speech. And a year later, I was blogging and I was presenting to user groups about running Oracle databases on Docker, probably the weirdest marriage ever. And those audiences, they're all converts. They're the curious. They're not the majority of database administrators, though. See, for most, it's business as usual. There's no plan to change. And with all the organizations that I've worked with, even those that have strong DevOps cultures, I notice that the database almost always lags behind or avoids modernization initiatives entirely. And that's frustrating. Frustrating because I see multi-billion dollar organizations with database management practices that are, for lack of a better word, primitive. Whole teams of DBAs with no central code repo, just collections of personal scripts. People making at-will manual changes untested to production databases from a command line with no ticket and no peer review whatsoever. Complex disaster recovery environments that were built and are managed just by copy pasting commands from emailed instructions or a Word document written by someone who's long since left the company. Now, each of these environments seems to share some common qualities. Compartmentalization or a sense of territories where only select people can work on certain systems. Inconsistencies in the form of, oh, the special trick that we need on this system, or some one-off steps that complicate management. Very low confidence that the behavior in a lower environment is going to predict function on any higher tier. Production architectures that aren't duplicated elsewhere. So things like clustering or replication that only exists in production. And overall, this sense of brittleness, that the database is fragile, that a gentle nudge is just going to knock it off that razor's edge of stability that it enjoys. Well, DevOps addresses those shortcomings. So why isn't the database world putting out the welcome mat for us? I think it has something to do with database administrators. We'll call it legendary objection to change. Legendary, really? Is that maybe taking it a bit too far? No, I don't think so. Couple of jokes for you. What does DBA stand for? Don't bother asking. Can anyone tell me what DBAs say? No. See, our reputation for saying no is the underlying truth that makes those just a little bit funny, you've got to admit. Which brings me to why you're here. My guess is you or your organization have databases and you want to put them into Docker or otherwise modernize them. And if you have databases, you probably have a database administrator, maybe a team of them, and they are the natural choice for doing the putting databases into Docker thing. But here you are. You're looking for some sort of way to get your DBAs to agree to put databases in containers or want to put databases in containers, searching for that secret to turn no into yes. Well, to get to that secret, we need to understand a few things first, and those are how database administrators perceive Docker and DevOps in general, how data and databases have become synonymous, and how we can drive adoption and realign the conversation to get what it is that we want. Well, let's begin with that perception. Wait, listen. Do you hear that? It's like a drum beat. Pretty catchy rhythm going on right there. Data, data, data. Yeah, it's like Christmas music in a mall. You cannot escape the headlines in business journals. Everywhere you read about the importance and value of data, how everything we do revolves around our data. So it isn't unreasonable that those people responsible for managing and securing that data will take their jobs very seriously. And of all the jobs in technology, I venture database folks are among the most cautious, and it explains why we adopt a bit of a careful, slow approach, have that reputation for saying no. We don't jump onto the latest technology bandwagon until it is proven safe, and we have a high bar for that. And despite its track record, Docker still feels a bit new and immature, even mysterious to those who are uninitiated. But Docker isn't the problem here. Docker is a subset of a much larger, more fundamental threat to our data. DevOps. Wait, DevOps is a threat to our data? Well, let me explain. This is Oreo. I run ultramarathons and she's my running and trading partner. She's also a very smart cookie. She knows left from right. She can find snakes. And she loves watching dogs on TV so much that she taught herself how to use a remote control so that she could turn on the television. And these are cattle. Now, they've likely never seen a TV, and while Oreo spends her night sleeping comfortably on a bed she lets my wife and I share a little tiny part of, they sleep outside in fields. Now, Oreo is my pet. She's irreplaceable. And yes, I could probably find another dog who would run with me and maybe even chew on a remote control until doggies appeared on the magic window in the living room. But it wouldn't be her. Now, these cattle, they don't have names. They have numbers. And that's why we don't get attached to them. Just like that farm of functional hosts that run your enterprise. And that's a major selling point of DevOps, right? Pets versus cattle. We stop naming things so we wouldn't get attached. We automate builds and we manage these huge fleets of identical silicon cattle without ever interacting with them. And when they fail a health check, we have automation that comes along and just blows them away, replaces them with a new host. So they're all commodities, and whether it's producing milk or meat or serving web pages, they are replaceable, anonymous, and temporary. But your databases are Oreo. We give databases names still, and probably will for some time to come. Because, like it or not, if you have legacy monolith databases like Oracle, DB2, SQL Server, and so on, they're not going away anytime soon. Relational databases are very difficult to break down into microservices, the way that we do with applications. So if you told me I had to treat my dog like cattle and make her sleep outside in a field, we're going to have a problem. Well, the same applies to your company's databases, except they're not really your company's databases. The data, yes, that belongs to the company, but the databases, well, like it or not, they belong to your DBAs. See, it's us, the DBAs. We teach databases how to do tricks. We feed them. We go for long runs in the mountains together. And they are our babies, and we get very attached to them. So when someone comes along and says, oh, the company's going DevOps, we're going to adopt this set of practices popularly known for treating infrastructure as interchangeable, replaceable, anonymous cattle, that's known for making things disappear when they fail a health check. Well, all that a DBA hears is that you're sending their dog to the DevOps farm. Not to mention the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that comes with it. Real or not, we worry that someone other than a DBA is going to have control over our databases, that we're going to be sharing resources or scaled up or down on hardware that's going to lead to some unpredictable performance, that we're going to have to work on a new platform and adjust all of our scripts and processes, that abstractions like containers that they aren't certified, and even if they are, aren't battle tested. And that one mistake, one tiny mistake in all that complex automation that we don't control, and bye-bye database. And of course, there are all the secondhand stories that we hear that perpetuate these myths and misconceptions about new technology. And that's why DevOps has a difficult time finding its footing in database circles, and why implementing Docker, or DevOps for that matter, in an existing environment chain, test, dev, and so on up through production, is a really big ask. So to drive adoption, we need to invent a purpose and an environment that isn't threatened by any of those concerns. And I'll speak to that in just a moment. But there's another piece that I want to address first. In DBA circles, there is a very common counter-argument against new technologies and against change in general. I'm guilty myself, and I think that as DBAs, we may do this unconsciously. It's not intentional. But it's a closing statement that is incredibly effective at ending discussions. Databases are special. You think about it. That is a powerful statement, and it lets us, DBAs, influence, redirect, even manipulate discussions around databases. And it's only possible because we don't make a distinction between data and databases. In fact, that argument doesn't really work anywhere else in an enterprise. Databases are different, and uniquely labeled as special. But are they really special? Are they special? No, they're not. Data is special. The database is not, no more so than any other component in the stack. The database, and here I'm talking about the software and configuration, an image or a container, if you will, it's an application, it's code that, like any program, performs some work based on rules. And that code is independent of my hardware. And regardless of how big or important my data is, the hardware determines the throughput, the software determines the action, and the data is just an object. Yet we use that term database to mean so many things. Most often, a whole collection of topology, processes, and so forth, and data. Data, database, one and the same. Data is special and valuable, and we allow databases to inherit that property, which makes them special and valuable. And special things get special treatment and helps maintain that status quo. But it's the status quo that's full of those problems I mentioned earlier, like compartmentalization, inconsistencies, poor confidence, configuration drift, and brittleness. But we can use this idea that databases are special to help flip the conversation, to drive DevOps adoption rather than oppose it. How do we do that? There are some benign, even reasonable sounding arguments that DBAs make against Docker and DevOps and change in general, and these should really raise alarms for you. There are phrases like, we have documentation. My pet peeve, we have backups. That couldn't happen. Automation doesn't make sense for just a few database hosts. And configuration management, that takes away the flexibility we need to effectively administer the database. Well, what's alarming about any of that? In the movie Apollo 13, there is a scene where Gene Kranz, he's the mission flight director, he says, "Failure is not an option." Now, Kranz didn't say this in real life. It was just written into the script for dramatic purposes. But it's this nice moment that inspires the NASA engineers to come up with the creative solutions that they did that overcame this series of challenges and bring the crew home safely. But I think it's a little naive. Think about it. Failure is not an option? We can't fail? No, failure is not an option because failure is a requirement. You will fail. Things are going to break. There will be a disaster. So better to be prepared for that inevitable and reduce the risks than hoping you're going to be able to figure out a way to minimize the damage in the midst of a crisis. So I want you to imagine a potential disaster that involves the database in your environment and think about, okay, what is that going to look like for my organization? Well, there shouldn't be any worries because there's documentation and you have backups, right? All right, well, here's another joke for you. What's the difference between backups and milk? People check milk to see if it's any good. See, unless you validate them on a regular basis and know how to use them, having backups just means you have files somewhere that were created by a backup process. It doesn't mean they're current, that they're complete, or that anyone knows how to use them. And that documentation, let me tell you, I love to cook. There are 2 shelves in our kitchen that are just the regular recipes, things that I make all the time. So I have lots of documentation on cooking, but I never really make the same thing twice. Because when I open a recipe I've made before, well, it's a reminder to me at best. I glance at it, to keep me on track, but am I reading it? No. 40 some odd years of cooking, I know what a teaspoon of salt looks like in my hand. I don't need to measure it out. My muscle memory kicks in and I work automatically. But automatic is not automated. And what we do as technologists is no different. Put me in a command line on a database server, I'm in my kitchen. I know where things are. I know how to do stuff. So yes, there may be a procedure. Sure, it may be documented in exquisite detail, but that recipe, it doesn't force me to do anything. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to come out a particular way, nor does it prevent us from being human, from anticipating or misreading those instructions. See, we as humans, we like to think we know how we'll respond in a crisis. But it's nearly always this unrealistic, optimistic vision that we have. And the less familiar we are with that potential event, well, the less clearly we are able to visualize it or anticipate the circumstances that we are going to meet. And so as that gap between expectation and reality widens, the more adrenaline seeps into our systems, the more the primitive brain kicks in. Well, primitive brain is fantastic. It does fight or flight. What it doesn't do, regulated, careful, deliberate thought, like you might need in the middle of a database recovery. So we start making mistakes and compromising. I just want to get things up and running again. This is good enough for now. We can fix these little things later. But we're probably not making notes about what those little things are that need to be fixing. All that we have is tunnel vision. It's all about getting it working again. There are a couple of things that we can do to improve outcomes in a disaster. First, minimize the manual steps. Less hands-on, fewer opportunities for human error. We're talking automation, we're talking artifacts. The second is developing our reactive skill set. When tasks become second nature for us, we're able to free up some cognitive load for solving those bigger problems. And this just comes from practice. Well, what does any of this have to do with Docker? And how does it overcome that perception and resistance to change? Remember earlier I said we needed to invent a new purpose and environment where our DBAs can use Docker and where those concerns about enterprise readiness weren't a factor? This is it. The road to getting DBAs to rethink methods begins when we challenge some of the assumptions and explore some potentially uncomfortable topics. And we can do that by asking questions like, do our backups work? Is our DR procedure current and accurate? Can we meet our recovery objectives? If we were to lose component X, would it be fatal? Is the database patched and safe from current exploits? Are we protected against inside and outside threats? Is testing in a lower environment a reliable indicator for production? Well, hopefully the answer to all of these is yes, and that's awesome. But yes isn't an answer. It's not enough. I want you to show your work. Prove it. Prove to me that you can do all of those things. You should expect to encounter some resistance, and that resistance is going to come in the form of, well, that's great. What infrastructure are we going to use? Docker on your laptop, on a spare server, in a cloud account? Well, why do we have to use Docker? Why can't we use something else? It's cost effective, portable, flexible. We use it everywhere else, and there are plenty of resources elsewhere in the organization that can help bring you up to speed. We can use it to build these reproducible test environments, and artifacts make spinning up and burning down our simulations very fast and very reliable. And the learning curve for Docker is probably much, much easier than a tool like Ansible, Terraform, or Vagrant. Well, why should we bother with this exercise at all? What's the point? Because databases are special. Because data is irreplaceable. because we need to do more to protect data at its source, the database, than anything else in the enterprise. And database administrators are the pivotal piece of that puzzle. As an organization, we need to be assured that the DBAs have everything they need when, not if, but when disaster strikes. And that means running through these different situations, refining the procedures, identifying dependencies, discovering if there are any missing assets that people need so that they feel confident that we can face those challenges and those adversities head on and successfully. Now, up until now, I've picked on the database admins, but there are responsibilities that the organization bears equally for this. The company has to provide resources and training and has to prioritize this effort. We need to recognize that these are not in your spare time activities. They should be written out as SMART goals. We need to set 360-degree accountability and trust via individual, team, departmental, even organizational KPIs, and create incentives, if necessary, to make sure that this happens. Now, all of this offers opportunities for our DBAs to learn and use Docker in a safe environment. What do I mean by safe? Well, we're not threatening anyone's pet. We're building throwaway systems, so they don't have to be pretty. They just need to prove that something works. There's no pressure or expectation that anything is going to be perfect. We're able to expose shortcomings in the way we've always done it, way of thinking, without any judgment or critique. We're creating situations where easier, faster, more reliable, more consistent solutions are going to naturally reveal themselves. We're challenging assumptions and techniques without labeling things as wrong or right. Instead, we're contrasting good against better. And we're establishing an ongoing process that begins with basic validations, but over time evolves as people's experience and skills grow so that we can capture and demonstrate more comprehensive or complex scenarios. See, people are fundamentally lazy. So if we set the stage for them to discover an easier or better way of doing something, we just have to let things run their course. And that's the formula. Appreciate the sense of ownership and attachment that DBAs have for their databases. Make those clear distinctions between data and databases. Provide non-threatening channels for learning Docker. Support those exercises with training, resources, mutual accountability. Pair container platforms with testing, training, and validation projects that provide business value and reinforce the importance of data and the individuals and teams that manage that data. Trust people to discover and adopt tools that improve their lives. And finally, last but not least, trust that Docker is cool and fun. I hope this helps advance any discussions that you have within your organization and that I've provided something useful for you to take away with you today. My gratitude goes out to the Docker team for inviting me to share this session with you and for all the work they do behind the scenes to plan and organize these events for us. Thank you everyone for attending today. I truly appreciate your attention and I wish you a wonderful and healthy 2022.